All right, welcome back. We're going to dive into topic 8 today, which is the first part of our psycholinguistics topic, that is the psychology of language. There will be topic 9 as well, continuing this topic of language, where we'll get deeper into the relationship between language and thought, and a little bit about how embodied cognition relates to language and how psychologists study it. And then we'll probably spend some time on the idea of whether, or the debate of whether animals have language or are capable of understanding or using language. But for this first part in topic 8, we're really just going to get into some of the basics about how language comprehension works from sort of the bottom-up and top-down perspective, and then we'll get a little into language disorders and what they tell us about from the kind of neuro perspective. So that's what this first video is about. I wanted to open it up with kind of a funny little clip at the start. For anyone who hasn't seen bad lip reading on the internet, we'll just see a little clip here of these. There's a lot more of them on YouTube.
How you feeling?
Egg roll. I wish I had a breeze running down my leg. I'd kill for a cookie. Stingray, a double-sided Scooby snack. Yeah, we pick our hotel. Help me burn that old man.
I can't,
yes,
dude.
You can. Let's freaking burn that guy. Hit him on the eyeball. Hey, don't offend me.
Can I have this sloth?
A skunk! I can't believe there's a manhole and he fell in it.
I want it now! I want cake now! I want it now!
I found Fido! Hey, I found Fido! I found Fido, you guys!
Stank! Ham bone!
Hey, I'd love to get you a Mai Tai. Yeah, come on, I'll make it myself.
Anyway, there's a bunch of these online. They're pretty funny. Obviously, those aren't the real words, but what we do when we actually hear other people use language and make sense of what they're saying is a lot more impressive than we usually give it credit for. So what's happening is someone's like flapping these pieces of meat at the front of their face and blowing air at you, and it's vibrating a bunch of molecules between your face and their face, and that vibration gets in your ear, and somehow from that we're able to, in a sense, read their mind. We're able to take ideas from inside our head and put them inside other people's head by making these sounds that often are kind of arbitrary sounds. So from the perspective of receiving language, of hearing someone else's language and making sense of it, the brain is doing actually a lot of different steps along the way. So we're going to start kind of at a little at the lower perceptual level, and then work up to some top-down or higher level cognitive effects to make sense of how the brain does this. So before we dive into that, I just want to talk about what this psycholinguistics or psychology of language topic is about. I want to make it clear, we're not just talking, when we talk about language, we don't just mean the ability to communicate something. So language, as it's defined by linguists or by psychologists who study language and cognition, is not just the ability to get information across from one to another. Lots of species do that. Birds communicate, but that doesn't mean that a linguist would say birds have language. So the properties that set language apart in terms of like the things that exist in all natural human languages that are sort of common to all things that we consider a language at the human level, would be not just the fact that it's communicative, that it gets information across from one to another, but also all natural languages are arbitrarily symbolic. In other words, we don't use pictures of trees in order to like write the word tree down, right? The word tree as written doesn't look like a tree, but also the sound tree, when we speak it in English or any other language, it doesn't necessarily sound like a tree. There's nothing wooden about the sounds we make with our meat flaps when we communicate tree to one another. So we have arbitrary placeholders, or combinations of arbitrary pieces that are put together that get the information across, but aren't just something we're pointing to, or something that evokes the natural sound or sight itself. Another property of language is that there's structure to it. There's order. It's regularly structured. In other words, some things are allowed and some things aren't. There are sort of rules to any language that make certain constructions valid, they're a valid construction in that language, and certain things that are not. So we'll talk about the idea of syntax a little later, or grammar, and that's the idea that when you put things together in a certain order within a given language, it's either correct or it's incorrect. It either works or it doesn't, right? And we can be kind of on the middle ground of slightly weird grammar that we can understand, but like there are things that just don't sound like English sentences, despite the fact they might use English words. If we just put them in a totally randomized order, it's all a bunch of English words, but it won't sound like a sentence, right? So the structure matters on top of just understanding each individual part, like each individual word or sound. Another thing that's common to all natural languages is that language is always structured at multiple levels. There's sort of a hierarchical setup to all languages that we know of. So in the case of spoken language, right, it starts with a tiny piece which is language sounds. We'll talk about this idea of phonemes in a minute, but the basic unit of speech sounds. And then words are made up of those sounds. So you can think of it kind of like syllables, right? Kind of like the little bits that we put together into a full word. And then words themselves are combined together using rules, right? So using that regular structure, those words get combined together into sentences, and sentences get combined into paragraphs, into discourse, right? And so psychologists are interested in all of these levels from the bottom up. We'll find a lot more perceptual psychologists interested at the sound side or the word side, and then you start to get into a lot of the more kind of pure cognitive psychology stuff at the word and sentence comprehension. We'll talk a lot about that stuff, and then we'll get to those higher levels in the next bit, the next set of slides. Okay, another property of language that's really important to note is that natural languages are generative, or sometimes it's called productive. Basically, we can create new pieces, things that have never been said before. So in a live class, what I would often do is have students just I would just start with a simple sentence, or have someone come up with a simple sentence like, the horse ran fast, and then ask someone to add something to the beginning or end of that sentence to make another sentence that also works. So the horse ran fast to the stables, or the horse ran fast to the grocery store. And then someone else can add to that. And like, John said the horse ran fast to the grocery store. And then someone else could add to that and say, like, my boss John said the horse ran fast to the grocery store. And someone could add to that, my boss John said the horse ran fast to the grocery store in order to pick up a unicorn sandwich, or whatever. If you do this for a while, you'll realize we can, within English, making totally valid sentences, we can very quickly and easily come up with something that you can be pretty sure has never been spoken in the history of all humans. And there have been billions and billions of humans speaking for thousands and thousands of years, and yet we can, in a minute, create something brand new that's never been spoken before. And we do that because our brain is able to understand the structure that goes into whatever language or languages that we speak. And we can use that structure in order to make new constructions that are valid and even carry meaning. People can understand something they've never heard before. And that's pretty impressive. That's something that is common to all natural languages, but is not necessarily the case in all, say, animal communication systems. And we'll come back to that debate about animal communication versus language soon. The last thing I want to mention, just about a quick overview of what makes language distinct, or what we mean by language, is that all natural languages have evolved over time. They change over time. So we sometimes say it's dynamic. Basically, new words show up, or new slang shows up, or even some of the grammar, the structure itself can change over time. So these things all taken together seem to be they kind of are what we're talking about when we talk about language. And I just want to make that clear, that's distinct from just plain communication, which we can do in lots of ways with simple gestures, right? Pointing to something is not language, but it can communicate things. That's different. We're interested in language, which is this more complex cognitive task. Okay, now the field of sort of cognitive psychologists who study language, that field is called psycholinguistics. And I define psycholinguistics as something like the relationship between linguistic behavior, so the actual like things people do with their meat flaps, with their vocal apparatus, with the articulators of their mouth, their lips, their voice box, things like that. The relationship between linguistic behavior and then psychological processes. That's the cognitive side. That's why psychology gets in on this linguistic stuff, even though there's already that separate field of linguistics. And obviously those two collaborate and overlap quite a bit. Now, One area that's studied a lot in psycholinguistics is the comprehension side. That's where we're going to start these slides. Comprehension in terms of like how we understand language. So when others use language, how do we make sense of it? How does the brain take, incoming sounds or sights if someone's using signed language or things that we read, but how do we take that as it comes in and make sense of it, organize it together, interpret it within our cognitive apparatus in order to actually get the idea that that person was trying to get across. Another angle, though, that people will study psycholinguistics is the production side. So how do we express or use language? How do we create new constructions? We'll talk a little about that as well. And then, as I said, the next set of slides, topic 9, will cover quite a bit on the relationship of language to thought. So really high-level cognitive stuff between language and how we think. And then what we won't get into quite as much, but a little bit, is the area of pragmatics. So some linguists and psycholinguists are interested more in how people use language in practice. So as a sort of social phenomenon. So people, researchers like Grice or others have studied things like turn-taking behavior in humans. So when you're having a conversation, how do people navigate those social roles of I'm talking now, but I need to stop talking now so that you can talk, and all the other things that we pick up as social creatures, and how we use the language or how it shows up in practice. That's pragmatics. We're just not going to cover quite as much of that. It's not as directly cognitive. It's closer to social psychology. Now, to get into some of the basics of how we comprehend language, how we actually make sense of incoming linguistic, sounds or whatever, we need to think about the basic components of a linguistic utterance. And I'm going to mostly concentrate for now on spoken language. Most of the things I talk about here will apply in some way. They'll apply pretty directly to signed language or written language as well. But just to start with the most well-studied area, we're going to talk about spoken language. So the basic components of a linguistic spoken utterance would be at kind of the lowest level, what we'll call phonemes. That is defined as speech sounds in a given language. We'll get into this in a little more detail in a second, but just to help you remember this, note that it has phone at the start of this term. So if you're trying to distinguish this term from other terms, the one with phone is the one that's all about the basic sounds of a language, the most basic little pieces of sound in a language. And so, you hold a phone to your ear for sounds. That might help you remember that. On the other hand, we'll talk a little about morphemes. Morphemes are kind of higher up in that hierarchy of language, hierarchy of structure. Morphemes are made up of a bunch of phonemes together. It could be, a single phoneme. So the word, the morpheme A might be made up of a single sound, phoneme speech sound like A. But morphemes can also be, you could think of it kind of like words, although it doesn't have to be words. We'll see that words may have multiple morphemes within them. But morphemes are kind of the smallest piece of language that carries a specific meaning, that has a specific meaning attached. So the speech sounds in a language like ah or b or t, those don't carry sounds on their own. But when you put them together, like bat, then that carries, that's a combination of a few sounds, but that carries meaning. The sound or the morpheme, the sound combination, bat, that would be a morpheme because it has a meaning, whether we're talking about the animal bat or the thing you use to hit a baseball. So phonemes are put together into morphemes, and then, of course, morphemes can be put together into words or made themselves stand alone as a word, and then words get put together into sentences. But these are sort of a couple of the base pieces that we'll talk about. Now, after that, what we'll get into a little more is the distinction between syntax and semantics. So that's another important thing when it comes to how we use language out loud or written, whatever, but how we use language is syntax is kind of the grammar of a language. So it's those rules that our brain has picked up on through a bunch of experience since we came out of the womb, maybe some of which we were genetically inclined to pick up. We'll talk about that debate. But like syntax is the grammar or the rules for what makes a valid, say, English sentence or a valid Spanish sentence or a valid sentence in Russian or whatever language we know. That would be syntax, the rules that are inherent in a given language. And then there's also the study of semantics is more about the meaning, like how meaning is carried through these pieces of language. So words themselves, but also how that syntax, the way we combine it, might alter or carry across the underlying meaning that we're trying to get across. So we'll talk more about those distinctions. I just want to bring up those terms. We'll get into each of those in more detail. So let's start at the lowest level. This is almost kind of starting from the perceptual level. And as we saw earlier in the semester, like our higher level cognitive abilities, whether it's language or memory or anything else that we need to make sense of, often starts with this perceptual stuff of incoming information hitting our sensory systems. And as we saw at the third topic of the semester, the perception stuff, that is not a simple process, and it's not a process that works only bottom up. In other words, the information is not just what's carried through the incoming sensory information. Our brain actively interprets that, actively makes sense of it using our past knowledge, our past experience, the context and cues and hints about what else is going on or has gone on recently or has primed us in our memory recently, what neurons have been activated recently. All of that changes how our brain interprets incoming sensory information. So we'll see, even at the level of making sense of speech sounds, being able to figure out what sound we're hearing, there are cognitive things going on here, which is why there's such an overlap between linguistics and psychology. So let's start at this bottom level with this idea of phonemes. Phonemes, as I said, these are the smallest pieces or smallest units of sound in a given spoken language. And so another way to think of this, or if you're trying to say what would really make something a phoneme, you could say it's the smallest unit of speech that, if you changed it, would change the meaning of a word. So let me give you an example. I could ask, what are the phonemes in the word bit? Right? So the word B-I-T, bit. When I say bit, I'm pronouncing a few different sounds in there, right? I've got a B sound, an I sound, and a T sound. And those three different sounds together that kind of cram together in that order, those make up the word bit. But think about any of those individual sounds, like the B sound at the start. If I change the B sound to some other sound, like P or S, then what I might end up with is pit or sit. So I've changed the meaning of the word, right? Bit means something different than pit or sit in English. I've changed the meaning of the word by changing that one little piece, that one little speech sound. That suggests that speech sound, if that speech sound is a phoneme, because if changed, it would change to a different meaning. Likewise, changing the I sound in the middle would change the word as well. So bit would become bat, or might become bot, depending on what sound I put in there instead. Or changing the T sound at the end of the word, right? That would make bit become something like bid or big, or whatever other speech sound I put at the end there. So that would be a way of saying, okay, I see how there's three different phonemes, three distinct speech sounds that make up the word bit. That's kind of one way you might identify different phonemes. Now, English there are different estimates, but we'll say somewhere in the range of 40 to 50 phonemes, depending on how we classify it. Linguists have some couple different systems, but something like around 20 different vowel sounds that we make in English, and up to about 24 different consonant sounds. But that's different than what we find in other languages. So other languages have different numbers of phonemes and different phonemes that they use. In other words, other languages may use sounds that we don't use, right? Like might be a sound in some languages, but not others. And there are sounds that English uses that you won't find in other languages. So just to give you a couple examples, a language of the Kung Bush people, the San tribes in the Kalahari, they have, in one of the languages, have around 141 distinct phonemes, distinct language sounds that, again, you can put these together in different combinations to make meaning out of them. Whereas other languages, like one in New Guinea, get by with only 11 phonemes. There are only 11 distinct speech sounds for that entire language, and yet can combine them together into a whole bunch of different words, and from those words, different sentences and different meanings, and the language functions with a different number of phonemes. Likewise, Arabic has no p phoneme, and Hawaiian has no t sound, and Mohawk has no sound, and there are a bunch of other exceptions. If you get into linguistics, you start to find, there's a big difference in terms of what set of sounds that any human can make with their vocal apparatus, but there's a difference in terms of what sounds show up in a given language, what happen to be valid speech sounds or phonemes for something like English versus Spanish versus Latin versus something else. So just to give you an example of what I'm talking about to make it more clear, here's a quick video with some of the main phonemes that are identified in English, just as an example.
The key sounds of English: 44 phonemes and 4 blends. 18 consonant phonemes. B, k, d, f, g, h, j, o.
We'll skip ahead to some vowels.
A, E, I, A, A, E, I, O.
You'll notice that phonemes, when linguists refer to them, use this little kind of a slash before and after to set apart and say, we're talking about a speech sound. This is how we write phonemes.
Oo, ow, oi.
We'll get to some R-controlled vowel sounds, like
ear.
or.
4 blends. Your, qu, you, x.
So anyway, that's the idea of phonemes. Those are the sounds. We're often not cognizant of the fact that we make and use these distinct sounds in English, or that there are a bunch of sounds we can make as humans that aren't part of English, like or whatever, like the sound, the sound of like snapping your tongue or something like that. Like those sounds don't, even though we can make them, they don't make up part of the English language. They could make up part of a language, right? They could show up in other languages, but that's what we mean by phonemes. Now, what I want us to think about is, how do we, when someone's putting a string of phonemes together, in other words, when they're using language at us, how do we hear that and make sense of that incoming information? It's a lot harder than you might think. So what I've got here at the top, this is a spectrogram. This is audio, like basically this is just pure auditory stimulus, what comes into our ear. And this is across time, right? So the beginning is on the left here, and this is the end of someone saying 2 words. This is someone saying the word speech segmentation, and this is what the physical stimulus looks like. In other words, this is the information going into our ear. This is the information our brain gets from those neurons in our cochlea that go pew, 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 pew when they get that input, right? And from all that, from this physical input, our brain has to be able to sort of reverse decode that and be able to figure out, oh, it's this sound and that sound and that sound and that sound in this particular order so that we can make sense of it. But I'd ask you, looking at this physical stimulus here, can you identify, or just even to start, let's just take a guess, right? There's a p, right? In speech segmentation, there's a p sound, a p sound. So where does that p sound start, or where does it show up in this spectrogram? Take a guess, like where you think it happens. Noticing that we have to have all of these sounds somewhere in here, where might the P show up? Or what about the G sound, right? In segmentation, there's a G, segmentation. Where does that G sound show up in this continuous, sound segment? And for that matter, where in this do you think we get the end of speech and the start of segmentation? So again, try and take a guess about where you think that happens. You might be surprised. Here's the actual answer. This is where the different parts, the different speech sounds are showing up when someone's saying speech segmentation in normal English speech. And that is not probably what you expected in terms of there's no clear, look here, there's no clear boundary between, say, one word and another, just like there's no clear boundary necessarily between one speech sound and another. What we've got is a continuity and a pattern here that somehow the brain is able to make sense of and organize this chaos, this continuous chaos, into an ordering and distinct sounds that we know go together into distinct words, and we separate out those words. That process, that complicated cognitive process that the brain does behind the scenes for us, that is called speech segmentation. So the process of identifying boundaries between words, boundaries between syllables, or even just boundaries between phonemes. In other words, picking out the different sounds and phonemes in spoken language, even though what we're dealing with is a physical signal that is continuous, that is unbroken, that doesn't have a pause between one word and another, doesn't have a clear demarcation or pause between one speech sound and another. So our brain is taking this messy thing and organizing it, just like it does with all the other perceptual processes like we talked about in topic 3. Now there's a problem here. Why is this so hard? Why is this so impressive that the brain can do this? The thing is, we don't just hear a simple linear string of one phoneme, then another phoneme, then another phoneme. We don't hear a simple combination of phonemes. And in fact, there's a lot of variability in the acoustic signal. I'll give some examples in a minute, but that variability in the acoustic signal, in the incoming bottom-up information through our sound system, that variability means there's no simple, straightforward correspondence between the acoustic signal and the individual phonemes that our brain is somehow able to still categorize. So our brain is adding a layer of interpretation on top of things to make sense of this ambiguous signal, just like it does when we perceive things visually, right? When we've got this mess of colors and lines and things in front of us, and our brain organizes that into a scene made up of individual objects, right? That gestalt perception, all of that stuff, the same kind of thing has to go on here in us making sense of language sounds. So, for example, the d phoneme, the phoneme, the sort of D sound that we actually make that in slightly different ways depending on the vowel that comes after it. So D versus do, we pronounce differently. Even the D part, just the D part, the phoneme that comes before the vowel. So the consonant phoneme that comes first, which you see kind of in blue here in these two different pronunciations. So the D versus the do. Both of those have a D phoneme at the start. That's the blue part before it goes on to the vowel phoneme, which would be the red part. Formant here is kind of the frequencies at which we sort of speak or make the vowel sounds. The formant transition is kind of the definition of consonants in the acoustic signal. But the thing is, we still perceive a d phoneme. We perceive it as the same d sound, even though we've got two very different things going into our ears in these two situations, right? The left situation, that's when we say d. When we've got the e sound coming after, that has a very different setup, a very different set of sounds going into the d phoneme than what's going in when the d is followed by a u for do. So in that case, we've actually got a sort of lowering transition versus a raising into a higher frequency transition. It's the same phoneme in terms of we still perceive it as a d sound, but the actual thing hitting our ears is different, right? Notice the difference between here and here. That means there's a difference in the physical signal hitting our ears, but we perceive it the same. This is an example of why we can't just rely on bottom-up perception. The signal itself, the auditory signal itself, doesn't carry the information we need to recognize that we've got the exact same phoneme used here. It just comes out or comes into our ears differently depending on what's about to happen with the vowel that comes after. So if you want to experience this yourself, I'll give you a second to try this, but I want you to pay attention to your lips. Like actually pay attention to the different shapes that your lips are making when you pronounce the B sound in the word bat, and when you pronounce the B sound in the word boot. So take a minute and notice when you do this, the rounded versus unrounded lips that you use to articulate that B sound differently depending on the context. In other words, depending on the sounds that come after the B sound. Notice that you'll still hear it as a B sound. We still perceive it as a B sound, but watch that you're actually making a different sound and a different shape with your lips. So take a moment now, pronounce bat and boot a few times while paying attention to your lips. So hopefully you tried that bat versus boot. We do very different things with our lips for the B phoneme, the B phoneme. And yet, despite the fact that it's making different physical sounds and that we see differences when you're pronouncing the B in bat, we see differences in the auditory spectrogram than we do when you're pronouncing the B in boot, So despite those differences in the physical signal, we still hear it as the same phoneme. Our brain still perceives it that way, which shows again that our brain's understanding is adding a layer of interpretation on the actual physical incoming signal. Another example would be like the physical sound when someone makes a b sound, right, for pronouncing one of those words like bat. That sound is different when the speaker is a man versus a woman, right? It's at different frequencies. There's some different patterns there. Or a young speaker versus an old speaker, or someone with an accent. So once again, how is our brain able to recognize that it's a b sound and actually like say, oh, then it's part of bat or bit or beat or whatever? How is our brain able to recognize those individual phonemes, given that they come in very different shapes, very different physical signals, depending on like the speaker characteristics or the circumstance, the context? Another issue, like why this is so hard, is daily speech is sloppy. So this is another example where there's variability in that acoustic signal that means we can't just follow simple rules of correspondence between the sound and what the phonemes that we perceive, because like when people say did you, they don't often pronounce it did you, they pronounce it did you. Like did you go to the store? Or Best Buy might become shortened to like Best Buy, right? I got my electronics at Best Buy before the COVID apocalypse. So spectrogram, this kind of picture of the physical signal of real speech, shows that people are constantly doing things like dropping letters from the words. They don't have a clear pause between words, like we saw in that example of speech segmentation, and yet still our brains are able to understand it. So if someone's clearly and slowly and with pause between the words pronouncing "what are you doing?" it looks like this, right? The picture on the left here. But in real life, what people do is, "What are you doing?" Where there's not clear pauses, or like between do and in, there's not a clear pause there, and yet our brain is still able to figure out what we're saying from that. That is the brain's kind of hard task that psychologists are interested in. That's where it gets cognitive. And what we're talking about really is how the brain is adding an organization or using top-down influences to make sense of that bottom-up incoming information. So one way that the brain solves this problem that's been studied by psychologists is what's called categorical perception. So categorical perception, the kind of classic version of this idea would be how when we look at the electromagnetic spectrum of visible light, so the visible spectrum from around 400 to 700 nanometers of light, that's like a continuous, right? There's no discrete jump from the red category to the orange category to the yellow category to the green category to the blue to the indigo or violet, and yet we perceive it, despite it being a continuum, our brain perceives it as discrete categories. We have names for things. And as we'll see in topic 9, when we talk about language and thought, those names may actually influence the way we interpret even something as straightforward as colors. We all have the same eyes, and yet growing up in a different linguistic environment, speaking a different language, may affect what you see, what you actually perceive and see when you look at the exact same physical visible stimulus as someone else. So categorical perception is this idea that our brain is organizing these incoming inputs that are on a continuous spectrum and interpreting it or perceiving it along these discrete categories that we may have learned along the way. So let me apply this now to language, the idea of categorical perception in language. Here what we've got in the bottom right here is a couple different pronunciations. We've got da or ta. So it's the same vowel sound. You can see actually it's pretty darn similar on the part that's black here, where we've got a lot of sounds going into, a lot around the 1000 hertz, so 1 kilohertz frequency, and quite a bit around the 2 kilohertz frequency. It's the same on both of these for the ah part, the vowel part, but for the formant transition and for the consonant part, the d versus the t sound, the biggest difference between these is what's called the voice onset time. You don't need to know that. I didn't highlight it as something you need to understand, but just notice like there's a small delay. This is a fraction of a second here for the d phoneme, but for the t phoneme, it's a much longer voice onset time, a much longer sort of delay between when we start making that consonant sound and when we switch to making the vowel sound. And yet, So kind of like the thing that our brain is able to pick up on to tell the difference between the d and the t, between those two consonant phonemes, one of the main things our brain picks up on is this voice onset time, right? That's an easy way for our brain to classify these two different sounds. And that's great, right? If every time we pronounced a d, that we always had about 17 milliseconds of voice onset time, and every time we pronounced a T sound, we always had about 90 milliseconds of voice onset time. If that was the case, then it would be very easy for the brain to tell these two things apart. And yet that's not quite the case. We get quite a bit of variability in terms of how people pronounce the d and how people pronounce the t. We can still tell those apart, and we'll see that there are still differences on average in how those two things are created that the brain can pick up on, but it's not so simple as them always having the exact same voice onset time. So looking at this and how this can, again, vary, the 17 can be a different number, the 91 can be a different number, psychologists have brought people into the lab to study how the brain organizes these various input signals, these various sounds that we hear, into distinct categories so that we hear a d sound, a d versus a t sound, despite it sometimes being 19 milliseconds of voice onset time, sometimes being 9 milliseconds of voice onset time, or 24 seconds, or 16 seconds, or something like that. Like, despite these different voice onset times that can go into us hearing a d, right, the different ways a d can be pronounced, our brain pretty much hears all of those as the same. So if it's somewhere in the, we'll say, 0 to 25 range of voice onset time, then we hear it as a d sound, a d sound, regardless of those being pretty darn distinct in terms of the spectrogram, in terms of what we see in the physical signal itself. And likewise, if we're up at the high end around 90 milliseconds or 80 or 70 or 60 milliseconds, those are very different speech signals. Those are very different things in the spectrogram, and yet we perceive all of them as the same t sound, the same t phoneme, t sound phoneme. So there's something interesting going on here where the brain takes something that's continuous, like voice onset time is continuous from 0 up to whatever milliseconds, and yet if it's within a certain range, we kind of just treat it as all the same. We take something that's continuous and say, no, I'm going to call all of this range from here to here a specific category. I'm going to categorize it down. That's what we call it, categorical perception, and say all of those I'm going to interpret, and again, this is all done behind the scenes, but unconsciously my brain is going to make me hear all of those, perceive all of those as the same sound, even though they're different physically. And likewise, all of these longer ones, the brain will perceive and hear as the same sound, even though it's a different sound. Our brain lumps it together into this category, the t category, right? Now, we know this is the case because in a lab, what we do is we come in and we manipulate voice onset time. So we take a recorded sound and all we do is we manipulate the voice onset time to be longer or shorter. So the independent variable we manipulate is this thing on the x-axis here, the voice onset time. And we look at whether people report that they're hearing a da or a ta, whether they're hearing a d or a t sound for these various voice onset times. And again, that's the only thing we change in the speech signal. And what we find is, as we take that short voice onset time and make it a little longer, a little longer, a little longer, they keep telling us, I'm hearing da, I'm hearing da, I'm hearing da. They don't hear a difference. They can't really tell a difference between those. And if we get up to a high enough, then they tell ta. But there's a certain point, a certain boundary point, where it basically very quickly shifts. There's just a sudden shift from perceiving one sound, one category, to a different sound, a different category. Just like when we're shifting, when we're showing people slightly different hues of red, slightly different hues of red, slightly different hues of red, suddenly they start labeling the next thing that they see orange. They don't see it as a continuous slow shift towards these things. Instead of, we classify one lump into red, one lump into orange, and it's very hard for us at those boundaries to really get the continuous nature of it. We don't perceive things continuously. We perceive things categorically or in discrete chunks. So that same thing is happening here, and we can find that in the lab. Now, there's basically this brief period where we get kind of a probabilistic range of people not being sure whether they're hearing da or ta. We get kind of different reports there. But you could think of this as we've got two different categories here, where even though there's quite a bit of variation, even more than there is in that sort of confusing land of I'm not sure which, we still perceive things the same. That's categorical perception. Another way we've shown this in the lab is basically taking like a ba sound versus a da sound. So they're very similar, right? The B versus the D sound in ba or da. They're very similar, but if we just make slight changes to one of these towards the other. So make these sort of incremental, tiny little continuous changes from one towards the other. What we find is people don't notice those changes. Their brain still perceives it as ba, as ba, as ba, as ba, as ba, even though the sound is different. The thing going into their ears is different. They don't perceive it as getting closer and closer and closer to something else. It just suddenly shifts. Once we make enough of a change, it just suddenly shifts to the other category. And then they along those different continuous ways we might pronounce or hear the da sound, we just hear it all as the same phoneme, the da phoneme. So that's another example of categorical perception that we see in the laboratory. So basically you could think of this as it's helpful for the brain to do this, right? Because by sorting everything into a limited number of discrete categories, it helps us from getting confused by all those variations I talked about earlier. That was the problem in the actual bottom-up signal itself, is there's this almost infinite variety of variation in terms of different voices, different sounds, the way those different sounds are made physically, depending on who's speaking, their accent, their age, things like that. And so our brain can better make sense of that if it just sort of ignores that variation and lumps anything within a given range into discrete categories that we're used to. So our actual perception, what we hear, doesn't necessarily match the world. The world is continuous. The physical signal is continuous, but our brain lumps things together into categories in order to make sense of it. It's a useful heuristic. It's a useful way to organize the physical world so we can do something with it. Now, just as a last side note about how we perceive language sounds, I want to talk about this phenomenon of what we might call multisensory perception or audio-visual perception, but another influence where basically something outside of the physical sound signal itself helps us perceive what we're hearing, what's coming into our ears. So, for example, one of the ways we identify phonemes seems to involve or come from looking at face or lip movements. So that's audio-visual perception. It's a combination, like what we perceive. The sound we hear isn't just what gets into our ears. The things that we see visually in front of us actually change what we hear. You can play the exact same sound to someone's ears, and they will hear a different thing depending on what they're looking at, which doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem like the way we normally think about sounds, right? Normally you think about our senses as being kind of distinct, and the sounds that you hear come from what hits your ears. The sights that you see come from what hits your eyes. And yet that's not the case. We know that the different sensory systems collaborate, they communicate within the brain, and that's why what we hear, in other words, what we experience in the auditory channel, will often be affected by the things in a different sense, like what we see. So in a sense, you could say we all kind of fall back on lip reading in things like a noisy environment because it helps us disambiguate when we've got some sort of noisy signal. When there's other sounds that might be blocking, masking, or combining with the sounds of someone we're talking to, we'll often focus on their lips while we're listening to them in order to hear in that ambiguous or noisy circumstance. So let's watch a brief demonstration of what's called the McGurk effect. This is one way psychologists have studied the influence of one sensory system changing what we interpret out of the incoming bottom-up information that's hitting another sensory system like our ears. Notice in this video you're going to watch how it shows that what we hear isn't just the information that hits our ears, it's the brain doing a lot of work.
Watch this experiment. It's called the McGurk effect.
Ba, 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 ba.
What do you think he's saying? If you think he's saying da, 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 you are in the grand majority. But now, close your eyes and listen instead of watching.
Ba, 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 ba.
The voice is saying ba, ba, ba. Now, let's replay it without the sound. Yes, it's true. his lips are saying ga, ga, ga. So how is it that when the lips are saying ga, 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 and the sound says ba, 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 that our brains read da, da, da?
What's happening here is called the McGurk effect, something really well studied in psycholinguistics. Basically, the face or the lips, what we're looking at visually, we can manipulate those in a laboratory so they don't match up with the soundtrack the way they normally do. Like normally when we say ba, 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 we hear ba, ba, ba. We're seeing people also make the B part with their lips. And likewise, if we have someone saying ga, ga, ga with a G sound, we also see them making the G sound with their face. Normally, vision and sound match up like that. But in the lab, we can alter the soundtrack in systematic ways to kind of understand how the brain is doing its interpretation work, to see the influences we're normally getting from the visual part of the signal without even realizing it. Then we can identify how the brain is doing this interpretation, like the influences we're normally getting from the visual part of the signal. And what we find is people's perception, what they hear in the auditory sense, it doesn't just come from the incoming sounds. Instead, the brain is using top-down approaches and contextual information from the other senses to identify what it thinks we're hearing. It's not just about organizing the bottom-up information, but organizing it in our brain given all these influences. So the McGurk effect shows that our brain didn't evolve to use each of our senses independently, but to combine information from all the channels we have in order to make our best guess at what's happening out in the world. In the lab, we poke around with the inputs to better understand this guessing mechanism that the brain is using to construct our perception moment to moment. All right, we're going to stop there for basic comprehension of language sounds. The next video is going to be on the comprehension of full-on words.